Welcome to the very first event of the Rising Powers Initiative at Boston University. We are delighted to welcome you this morning from wherever in the world you may be watching. So it might be evening for some of you, afternoon for some of you, and hopefully not the middle of the night for many of you. So I would like to first introduce the Rising Power Initiative, which is a new program that we have just launched at the Pardee Center for the Study of Longer Range Future at Boston University, as well as some of our core faculty, and then bring you on board for our panelists in our panel today, which is on the rise of China, a huge and important topic, particularly as the new Biden administration takes office. So the Rising Powers Initiative has a mission, and our mission is to study 5 emerging powers: China, India, Germany as the leader of the European Union, Brazil, and ASEAN. And what we do is we are an interdisciplinary program, and we bring together these regions in comparative perspective across 3 issue areas of security and cooperation, diplomacy and governance, and health and human capital. And we aim to be policy oriented as well as academically relevant. And so the goal is to produce both cutting edge academic research as well as policy recommendations for policymakers. So some of the core faculty who are key in our issue areas are present today. And I'll begin by introducing Professor Josh Shifrinson, who is our lead faculty in the area of security and cooperation. And Professor Shifrinson is an assistant professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and the author of Rising Titans, Falling Giants: How Great Powers Exploit Power Shifts, which he'll be speaking about today on our panel. We also have, in the areas of diplomacy and governance, Ambassador Jorge Heine, who is a research professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies. He was Chile's ambassador to both China and India. And he's currently a non-resident fellow at the Wilson Center, and he is the author of 15 books. In diplomacy and governance, we also have Professor Kevin Gallagher, who is professor of global development policy and the director of the Global Development Center at Boston University. He's currently serving on the United Nations Committee for Development Policy, and he is the author of 6 books. Finally, we have Professor Mahesh Kara, who has joined us just in time, who is the lead faculty in the area of health and human capital, and he's an assistant professor of global development policy and the associate director of the Human Capital Initiative at Boston University. And as a health economist, he worked for the Population Reference Bureau and consulted for the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the Population Council in his capacity as an expert on health economics and applied demography. While this is our very, very first event, and we're delighted to host all of you, we also have others coming up this semester on the RCEP and Indo-Pacific in March, on demography and superpowers in April, and how rising powers use institutions to advance themselves and gain status at the end of April. With that being said, I will now turn to our very distinguished panelists. And I am absolutely delighted and honored to welcome both of them, Professor Aaron Friedberg and Professor Stacie Goddard. Professor Friedberg is a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He is also the co-director of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs Center for International Security Studies, and a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research. And from 2003 to 2005, he served in the office of the Vice President of the United States as Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs and Director of Policy Planning. And he is the author of numerous books, including Weary Titan, Britain and the Experience of Relative Decline, and most recently, Beyond Air-Sea Battle, the Debate over US Military Strategy in Asia. Professor Goddard is the Mildred Lane Kemper Professor of Political Science and the Faculty Director of the Madeleine Corbel Albright Institute for Global Affairs at Wellesley College. She is a non-resident fellow at Quincy Institute and the author of 2 books, both of which I teach in 2 different classes. One is Indivisible Territory and the Politics of Legitimacy, and the other, which we hope she will touch on today, the more recent, When Right Makes Might, Rising Powers and World Order. So the reason why we conceived of this panel at RPI is essentially because we wanted to understand the United States-China relationship in both theoretical and in policy contexts. As academics, theory matters for us, right? It's important. But for at least this group, the point of theory is also to use it to analyze and study the real world. So policy is a very, very consistent and important theme in all of our works. We are all the authors of fairly recent books on rising powers and world order. Perhaps mine is the most recent, as of 2 weeks ago. Each of us utilize theoretical frameworks to understand the rise of China today. So let me turn it over to Aaron and ask him to begin by, Aaron, could you tell us what do you think the main policy issues are today that are so key to the United States-China relationship and that are essentially framing the relationship?
Well, first, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and congratulations on this new initiative. It's a special pleasure to be here for the launch of that. I would like to try to answer your question a little bit indirectly, if I could. And as someone interested not only in policy and theory, but also history, my first inclination is always to go backwards. So you'll have to forgive me for doing that. But I want to say a few words about the past, the present, and the future of the relationship between the United States and China, or really more broadly between China and the liberal democratic world. It seems to me clear at this point that the United States and China are engaged in an increasingly open and intense and now multidimensional rivalry. I think that actually has been underway, certainly from the Chinese perspective, for over 30 years. It goes back at least to the end of the Cold War. And it's driven, I think, by two factors. One, the traditional familiar dynamics of power politics, situations where you have a narrowing gap in power between a previously dominant power and one that's rising rapidly, have historically tended to give rise to tension and sometimes to conflict. I'm not a big believer in the Thucydides trap, but the dynamics that it embodies, I think, are real. So there's been a narrowing in the gap in power between the United States and China, but that is not, in my view, all there is to it. There is also a significant ideological component to this and an ideological driver, a gap between the two, again, certainly as perceived from the CCP perspective. CCP, I think, has always viewed the relationship with the United States and the West in ideological terms. And I think increasingly the United States and other democracies are starting to see the relationship and in those terms and to view China, at least in part, through an ideological lens. So if the power gap is narrowing, the ideological gap or the perceived ideological gap, difference between the regimes is widening. How did we get where we are now in terms of the specifics of the relationship? If I had to sum it up, I would say each side had its strategy. I'll say a few words in a minute about what those were at the outset of this, so going back 30 years or so. Broadly speaking, at least to the moment, China's strategy has worked better than the strategy that the United States pursued towards China. And the United States has been scrambling in recent years to adjust. Moreover, I would say, the reason for the failure, at least of the engagement portion of the US strategy, has been an underestimation of the resilience, the resourcefulness, the resolve, and also the ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party. So this US-China rivalry, I think, is now in its third phase. And the first one extends, I think, from 1989 to 2008. So from Tiananmen to the beginning of the global financial crisis. And during this period, both the United States and China pursued more or less stable strategies. And during this period also, significantly, I think both sides thought that time was on its side. The US strategy combined engagement, economic, diplomatic, cultural, educational, and so on, with a balancing component, an attempt to maintain a balance of power, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, that was favorable to the United States and its democratic allies. And the goals of the US strategy were threefold. First, to kind of draw China into the existing international order, to encourage it to become, as the Bush administration term of art had it, a responsible stakeholder in the existing system. So really a status quo power. Two, there was a strong belief that engaging China, again, drawing it into the global economic system, would promote economic liberalization, move toward further and further towards a really market-based economic system, and that eventually these tendencies would lead to political liberalization. And there's been a certain amount of retrospective cleaning up of things that people said and didn't say. Some people are running around saying, well, we never told you they were going to liberalize politically. That really isn't true. It's certainly not true of top political leaders and political figures, not only in the United States, but in the West more generally. So that was the US strategy. China's strategy is captured in Deng Xiaoping's famous admonition after Tiananmen and right before the collapse of the Soviet Union, that China had to hide and bide. It had to bide its time, take advantage of engagement, but also take steps to preserve CCP rule. And that was really the key to everything. To build up China's comprehensive national power, all the different elements of its power, and to advance cautiously to extend China's influence. Regionally, I think Chinese leaders have had in their heads for some time that ultimately their country should once again be the preponderant power in Eastern Eurasia. And globally, I think the thinking has evolved and is still evolving, but the view has been in the long run, China should be a truly global power on par with and perhaps at some point even superior to the United States. So that's the first phase. The second phase, I would say, goes from 2008 to 2016, and it's marked by increasing Chinese assertiveness as seen from a US and Western perspective, and I would say a fairly limited US response to that shift. And the shift really begins in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. It accelerates and becomes more obvious after the rise to power of Xi Jinping at the end of 2012 and beginning of 2013. And during this period, I think China's basic goals, as I outlined before, remain the same, but it has been pushing harder and more openly to achieve them, and has self-consciously and deliberately dispensed with the idea of hiding and biding. Now, why this change occurred is a puzzle, and I think it's something that future historians are going to wrestle with, because it seems as if it may have been premature and could turn out to be counterproductive. I think the jury is out on that, but there are some reasons to think that might be the case. So why do it? Especially when things seemed from the outside to be going fairly well for China at this point. The change, I think, was driven, as I would say, almost every aspect of Chinese policy has been driven by a mix of ambition and insecurity. There was, and this is, I think, becoming increasingly clear as some materials become available from this period, there was a shift in the kind of official assessment of the trends in the balance of power. And basically the judgment was the United States was declining more rapidly than had been anticipated. And China therefore had the opportunity to increase its relative power more rapidly than perhaps Chinese policymakers had hoped. But at the same time, there was increasing anxiety about China's future economic growth, a recognition of the inadequacy of its existing economic model, about social stability, and about the likelihood, and indeed, I think from the perspective of China's leaders, the inevitability that at some point the United States would start pushing back. In 2002, the Chinese leadership adopted a notion of a 20-year period of strategic opportunity, the gist of which was China would have 2 decades in which to build up its power, essentially unmolested by the United States, because the United States would be preoccupied, among other things, with the global war on terrorism. It's not an accident that this comes after 9/11. But the idea that there was a window or a period also implied that at some point it would close. and this would come to an end, and there would be a period of intensifying rivalry. So I think there was and has been a sense of urgency behind driving China's policy. And these two tendencies, the ambition, the insecurity, sort of come together and are manifest in increasing assertiveness. It starts in the maritime domain, and it's an effort to sort of create facts on the ground in interactions with Japan, with the Philippines, with Vietnam, but also, I think, and significantly, to mobilize nationalist sentiment in support of the regime by cultivating sort of modulated conflicts with other powers, including increasingly as time went by with the United States. And the competition also began visibly to expand in two dimensions, no longer being limited to the Asia Pacific region, no longer being focused only on the military or diplomatic dimensions. It expands geographically from a regional to a truly global rivalry, and functionally from this more traditional military diplomatic focus to one that encompasses economic and technological competition and also political warfare and ideological competition. The US response to all of this was, as I said a minute ago, limited. It was not non-existent. There was growing concern about where China was going, but for various reasons, although the Obama administration announced its intention to pivot, to focus more on China and on Asia, it wasn't able to do as much as I think it intended to do. And coming back to my balancing engagements formula, what the Obama administration tried to do was to ramp up the balancing part, working more with allies, talking about a new strategy, air-sea battle, but also to preserve the engagement relationship with maybe a few adjustments. And the broad objectives of the strategy, I think, remained unchanged. The hope, the expectation that eventually China would be brought into the system and would change. The last phase is the one we're in now, that I think starts in 2016, and maybe we could say it starts a little earlier, but certainly starts with the advent of the Trump administration. And one way of thinking about what the Trump administration did was that its policies were a belated reaction, and maybe in some respects an overreaction to the recognition that the engagement portion of US strategy had failed to achieve its objectives. That lo and behold, China is wealthier and stronger as expected, but it's also more repressive and more militantly nationalistic at home. Instead of liberalizing economically, it's more obviously mercantilist in its economic policies, and it is in many respects more openly assertive or even aggressive in its external behavior. However one measures it, it is clearly not a status quo power. It wants to revise various aspects of the regional order and the global order too, and China's leaders now say so. The Trump administration tried to ratchet up the balancing part, not so different from the Obama administration. The real novelty of Trump's policies were on the engagement side of the formula, and an attempt to constrict engagement in various respects, certainly in the economic relationship, also in the sort of societal relationship as well. All of this was intensified by the pandemic and also by China's response, not only to the pandemic, but to what the Trump administration was doing. And basically what China under Xi Jinping has done is to step on the gas even harder, I think, than it was doing before. Now, Trump policy had a number of peculiarities, just note two. Until the very end, it downplayed human rights and ideology in a way that made it very different from previous American administrations. And I think that was a reflection of the peculiarities of Trump himself. It also rejected explicitly the old objective of American policy. We're not going to change China, but it didn't really define a new one. If that isn't what we're doing, what are we doing? So the Biden administration is, of course, very new. This is going to be a test of whether there is, in fact, as many have said, a kind of new consensus in American politics about China. The new administration certainly seems to agree with its predecessor regarding the existence and the severity of the challenge from China, and has been explicit in saying we're not going to go back to the policies of the Obama years. And one way of thinking about the dilemmas they face, or the menu in front of them, is what are they going to add to what Trump did? What are they going to subtract? And what are they going to keep the same? We know what they say they want to add: more working with allies to try to balance, more efforts to cooperate with China, maintain cooperation with China on global issues like climate change, more emphasis on human rights. But what about trade and technology? There seems to be more continuity than difference. What about countering China's influence operations? What about defense spending and strategy, and so on? So without really having entirely answered your question about the policy issues, and there are a whole array of really interesting and pressing problems: what to do about Taiwan, should the US try to organize a boycott of the Olympics next year, what to do about the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed. And perhaps if people want, we can talk about those things. But I wanted to close with four sort of broader questions about the future, questions where, to a certain extent, I think theory, international relations theory, may be helpful, at least in getting us started in thinking about these, what the answers may be. But it's not so helpful in some areas, and we may need to refer to other bodies of knowledge, including history, perhaps, to shed light on these questions. So let me just quickly run through them. First, what does intense strategic competition under conditions of high economic interdependence actually look like? The Cold War analogy is not very helpful, as many people have pointed out, because one big difference is the degree of economic interdependence between the United States and China. But as we're seeing, that interdependence doesn't mean that there can't be intensifying rivalry. So we've got both, at least for the time being. And so one question might be, are earlier historical periods in some way more illuminating, periods in which you had great powers that were competing in various ways, but were also pretty tightly connected economically? Or is modern economic globalization something that's so different that previous periods don't really shed much light? So that's question number one. Question number two, will the balance of power balance? And what will the world look like 10 or 20 years from now if it doesn't? Theory of international relations tells us, I forget the line from Waltz, but it's something like, if there's anything that approaches a law of nature in international relations, it's that the balance of power balances. But we know from experience that it doesn't always happen right away. There can be friction and delay, or rising powers can use divide and conquer strategies to slow down balancing reactions, but there's certainly a strong impulse in that direction, and I think we see some of that. As to what the world might look like, is it going to be organized around spheres of influence? Will there be zones of competition? And I think one thing that's emerging that has not received very much attention until very recently in the US is the importance of the global South in China's strategy and its thinking about how it wants to reshape the world in ways that it thinks will be beneficial. And I think what that suggests, and we're starting to see some indications of that, is that from a US and Western perspective, the global South is once again going to emerge as a potentially important domain of competition, in addition to its other roles. So that's number two. Question number three, will the global economy fragment? The early versions of hegemonic stability theory would lead us to conclude that the answer is yes. If the US was hegemonic and its hegemony is declining, then an open international system will not persist. The sort of after hegemony revisions of that theory suggested that cooperation was possible and could keep a global economy open even without a hegemon. But if you read it carefully, what people like Cohen and others said was that, or that what they assumed was that there would be a considerable commonality of values as well as interests among the powers that were supposedly cooperating to keep the system together. And we may not have that now. If, in fact, the global economy does fragment, or the openness of the current system ends, what is going to replace it? Can we imagine eventually a Sinocentric global system if China were to continue to grow and eventually wind up with an economy 4 times the size of the United States? It would be the hegemon. How would it organize a global economy? And if you go back and read Bob Gilpin, what you conclude, I think, is that liberal powers create open systems because not only because they benefit from them, but because they reflect their beliefs and values. Illiberal powers, I would submit, are likely to create very different kinds of global economic systems. Are we going to have regional blocks, ideological blocks, going back to something that more closely resembled the Cold War? And the last, and to me, sort of the biggest question is, I would frame in the following way. If this is, as the European Union said in 2019, a systemic rivalry between China and not only the US, but the Western liberal democratic world, which system has the advantage? Which system will have the advantage in the long run? Will liberal democracy win again? And I mean, it seems like only yesterday to me, but I realize some of you may not have quite the vivid memories that I do, but it was 30 years ago that people were concluding that history had ended and liberal democracy was the dominant form. And we're not so sure now. And we're not so sure in part because we don't know yet whether, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party will succeed in doing what it very clearly, I think, intends to do or wants to do, which is to build a system that combines extraordinary repression and control with a capacity for technological innovation and continuing economic dynamism. And a lot of our theories tell us that those things are incompatible and therefore we're going to come out on top, but that may not be true. So with that cheerful thought, let me close.
Wow, that was a there were so many points in there, and I feel like every single one on this panel can take one of those questions and respond to it. But I want to turn to Stacie right now. Stacie, what's interesting to me about what Aaron is saying is, I mean, there are 2 really points that stood out to me. One is about how the United States tried to draw China in and failed, right? So it tried to accommodate China and failed, and then changed the strategy. And the other point that he talked about, which came right at the end about the Trump administration, was that they explicitly rejected the old policy, but did not really outline a new one. And in many ways, I feel like that's true of China as well, right? They don't really have a new policy while rejecting, the old policies. Your book very much talks about this, right? Because you're really looking at the question of why is it that great powers accommodate some rising powers, but they contain other rising powers? And here, what we're seeing is a great power move from accommodation, right? If we buy into what Aaron's saying, and then moving to containment. So if I could just open it up to you right now to respond to all of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I realized and first of all, Manjari, thank you so much for bringing us together today. It's great to be here and contributing to this, and also hopefully get to talk more about your new book as well. And to your question, Manjari, as Aaron was talking, I was thinking how much my comments, I think, will build off of the questions that he posed, and hopefully build and not repeat. Because also like Aaron, and I think like Josh, I also tend to be somebody who I enjoy looking at history, so I will use this moment to answer your questions, but also look a little backwards as well as I try to look forwards as well. But I want to kind of, in that spirit, I kind of want to take a few moments and step back before getting to the question about current policy and the Biden administration. And I really kind of want to split up the responses to your questions into 3 different parts, and kind of revisit this question that Aaron raised, and think about why did the United States pursue this strategy of engagement, why it is that China shifted from some of their policies in the time period that Aaron said, and then think a little bit about what the Biden administration should do next. And I was going to take about 10 minutes to do that. Is that okay, Manjari? Okay, fantastic.
That sounds great.
Great. And throughout all this, I want to highlight something that is Manjari mentioned that I really look at in my own book, which is the role of what I call legitimation, or basically the ways in which rising powers justify their own foreign policies as they're rising, and how that actually affects the way great powers react. Because I think that explains not only a lot of the dynamics historically, but kind of sets the stage as we're moving forward into the Biden administration. So I want to start with this first question of why it is the United States adopted this policy of engagement. And I think this is important because there's a lot of retrospective analysis of this. On the one hand, it almost seems like now having this camp saying engagement was the policy of the United States did, it was wrong. It was always wrong. Don't even think about doing that anymore. And then I actually really appreciated Erin's point that we also seem to have some people who deny that engagement was ever a thing. And I know I have moments that I'm going back through quotations and saying, but you said it. You said that this is what the policy was going to do. So it really was a thing. There really did seem to be this moment, really picking up, I would say, in the 1990s in the Clinton administration, that the United States put forward a policy of engagement, the idea of the United States engaged economically with China, worked diplomatically with China, incorporated in particular China into international institutions, things like the World Trade Organization, that China would then become kind of at the minimum, a more responsible version of itself, right? A kind of a responsible great power was always the language. And at a maximum would actually become power more like the United States, right? That it would liberalize to some extent, liberalize not only economically, but begin to liberalize domestically in terms of its regime as well. And one of the reasons there's been so much reflection on this policy is, I think, the sense so many years on that not only did engagement not achieve that maximum goal, but that it actually helped facilitate the rise of China, that it turned it into this much more powerful actor that's capable in engaging in pure competition with the United States today. So I think that's one of the reasons we have that kind of retrospection on the moment and trying to understand why it is the United States decided to engage in foreign policy. Now, in my own work and thinking about this, I tend to give the argument that the United States was responding in many ways to what China was saying about itself and what it was saying about its own actions as a rising power in international politics. And just really briefly, in my studies of rising powers, what I found is that great powers tend to react in part to rising powers, and they make their decisions about accommodation or confrontation based on how rising powers are justifying their increasingly expansionist foreign policy. My kind of view is all rising powers behave in somewhat revisionist and expansionist ways. That's not surprising. You're growing in power, you have some interest, and you're interested in using that power to get those interests. But it's never quite clear how far that rising power is going to go. And in particular, are they trying to make limited revisions to the system, or are they really engaging in some sort of revolutionary plan? And I think the question for the United States was always, is China going to engage in some limited revision, territorial revision in the South China Seas, or is it going to take aim at the liberal institutions the United States had constructed, since, as the story goes, since the end of World War II. China was aware of this, and what the strategy was oftentimes rhetorical and framing a lot of China's leaders, framing its own foreign policy and plans in terms of the existing rules and norms of the liberal international order. And, as I kind of chart out, you can actually see this adopted, not just haphazardly, but as a very kind of strategic plan to offer these explanations. So, whereas in the 1970s, for example, China's leaders would dismiss international law, liberal international law, as a bourgeois project, something that it wasn't going to engage in. By the 1990s and 2000s, we see China actually employing and deploying teams of international lawyers to figure out kind of the rules and norms of UNCLOS, of the laws of the seas, in order to deploy this language and justifying expansion into the South China Seas, right? So we see this kind of increasing appeal to liberal norms. And my argument is that the United States reacted to it. And I'm not saying they were completely naive and said, oh, this is our chance, but a lot of policymakers within the United States said these are really signs that China is willing to go along, that it's not a revolutionary power. And this is a power that we can actually engage in. So it's really was these type of rhetorical appeals that brought the United States into this engagement policy. And I think that's important, not just for what happened historically, but for two things that happened after that. The first of which is something that Aaron also highlighted, which is explaining the shift in China's policy in the period. I would mark it somewhere after 2009, 2010, but kind of ramping up through that decade. And I think Aaron, I think you're right, kind of noting that there might have been some miscalculation on China's part about United States power. But I also think it's important to realize that for China, some of the rhetorical policies they were using didn't seem so sustainable, right? And what do I mean by rhetorical policies? Well, one thing, and that actually one of Manjari's advisors, Ian Johnson, has pointed out, is that China's rhetoric becomes more assertive before its actions do. Right? That if you actually chart what China's doing, for example, in the South China Seas in the early part of the 2010s, it doesn't look much different than what it's doing before. But what you do begin to hear is a much more nationalist and assertive rhetoric that's being used to explain what China's doing in the South China Seas. So, for example, a lot more appeals to things like China's core interest, right? A lot more direct appeals to China's rights as a sovereign rising power. A lot more appeals to actually rectifying what had happened during what China calls the century of humiliation, right? So why do we hear that type of rhetorical shift? Why doesn't China just keep saying, well, no, we're going to work within institutions to make all of this right. Don't worry, we're pretty liberal, right? And my argument actually focuses, on the fact that rising powers, while they want to kind of sate existing great powers' fears, they also need to pay attention to what's happening at home. And I think part of what's happening at home for China in that decade is increasing worries, or I should actually say not just China, but the CCP is increasing worries about their own legitimacy. Right? They're no longer ideologically communist. They can't appeal to that anymore. They don't have that type of legitimation platform. Looking forward, they're worried about an economic slowdown. So you can't just simply say that your legitimacy is going to rest in output and economic growth. So one thing that's sitting there is the idea that you can begin to make nationalist appeals, that you can begin to talk about, make these type of appeals to great power or prestige, right? And those are the type of appeals that I think a lot of China's leaders think can mobilize and continue to mobilize their population behind a rising China, right? Behind China's foreign policy. But the trick is that it's precisely those type of appeals that begin to look really revolutionary to existing great powers, and particularly to the United States, right? They begin to look contrary to the United States goals of maintaining these liberal institutions, right? So China, I think by the mid-2010s, their leaders are having this difficulty trying to balance how they're going to portray their foreign policy to an outside audience on the one hand, and how they're going to portray it at home on the other. And to me, that explains a lot of that shift in how we come to view China as being more assertive in this period. And I just want to conclude, because I want to keep this brief. I know we're going to have a lot of Q&A coming up with what all this means. Like, again, this has kind of been a retrospective look, what all this means for the Biden administration. And I think that there are a couple things going on. First, to my mind, the narrative and understanding of China's behavior as being much more assertive is definitely become more locked in at this point. And I think that's something that's not going to change. It started might have started during the Trump administration, even during the Obama administration, but I think this is very much settled in the Biden administration. And hence now we have all of these various conversations about great power competition and return to great power competition. And I think that that's part of that type of understanding of China's intentions. And on the one hand, I think there's something fine with that, right? I think that the kind of move towards the belief that simply because China was making appeals to liberal rules and norms and the idea that therefore it was going to liberalize, that was a problem, right? That overinvested in an understanding of China's rhetoric. My concern, however, is that successive United States administrations, as well as congressional members, are reading in now to China's rhetoric a revolutionary plan that doesn't exist. Right? I'm not sure exactly what China intends to do over the next decade, and frankly, I don't think China's sure what it intends to do over the next decade, right? But I think that if the United States gets locked into a perception because of China's rhetoric that it's dedicated to some sort of revolutionary program to overthrow a liberal system, that's going to be a problem in and of itself. And it's going to be a problem for a couple of reasons. And this is where I'll conclude. It's going to be a problem because it's going to end up overshadowing places where not only the United States needs to collaborate with China and must collaborate with China, and particularly on issues of climate change and on issues of arms control, right? So if the narrative becomes always one of revolutionary aims, the United States is going to have a hard time finding that bargaining range. And the second thing that I think is really important here is that the United States needs to come to a period where it really thinks about what its interests are in the Indo-Pacific. So really difficult questions about about Taiwan, really difficult questions about the South China Seas and where the United States interests lie. I'm not saying they're easy, and frankly, I don't have answers to them, but I don't think the answer is to turn China into an insatiable revolutionary power where the United States needs to confront on every single flank if it's going to deal with it, right? And so I would hate to see that type of understanding of China based on the shift in legitimation strategies obscure the types of big decisions that the United States needs to make. With that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Stacie. Yeah, and I think I agree with you. And I think the worry about that is that we are also getting locked into those kinds of rhetoric, just as China, as you said, is getting locked into an assertive rhetoric. And it's interesting you should bring up Ian's work because I'm reminded of his piece on a system of orders, right, where he doesn't talk about international orders being monolithic, but really it looks at the issue areas and says, yes, in the maritime area, China is indeed becoming assertive. But then if you look at other areas, particularly if you look at core institutions of the liberal international order, like the IMF or the WTO, the US and China are on the same page. So that's really interesting. And later, I'd love to hear Aaron's take on if he thinks that's still true. So just turning it over to Josh. Josh, I mean, your book is and I'm laughing because I'm thinking that it's kind of a scary book, right? Because it's really talking about how rising powers treat declining powers. So we're going into this assuming that we're buying into this idea of the United States become as a declining power, which is we see this more and more in newspapers and in articles. And what you're suggesting is whether the rising power is supportive of the declining power or not really depends on their perception of the declining power, how weak or strong they see the declining power is. So could you use some of that to actually just frame what both Stacie and Aaron have said so far?
Of course, Manjari, and thank you for plugging the book, of course, and more importantly, organizing this really wonderful initiative and bringing in both Aaron and Stacie, who both of whose work I've long admired and engaged with. So,
well, I could not have done this without you. So we absolutely did this together. So,
well, I will, as the assistant professor in the group, I will happily take whatever compliments I can get. Let me begin by noting that I began researching great power rise and decline. Let me give a little bit of background before pivoting to the question that you posed, Manjari. I began researching great power rise and decline actually more than a decade ago, right around the time of the US economic crash, when everyone was worried about the decline of the United States and the possibility that in relatively rising countries like China, because after all, one state's decline is another's relative rise, at least in geopolitical terms, that these rising powers would somehow kick declining states to the curb or take advantage of the United States. It's the nth degree. And echoing Aaron's call to try to move beyond contemporary policy debates, this struck me as a really meaty theoretical and empirical question. And as you noted, Manjari, in what eventually became my book, I argued that there actually can be situations when rising states, relatively rising states, engage and support declining great powers by providing them economic assistance, military aid, favorable diplomatic deals, and the like. But those situations tend to emerge when even a relatively rising state surveys the world or surveys its regional and security environment, as the case might be, and says to itself, well, gosh darn it, I know I have this declining state and it would be really great for me if that declining state got weaker. But you know what? I have this other concern out there, this other threat out there, and the declining state may be of use to me against that other threat. So maybe I need to bolster them. Maybe I need to help them out in some way. Whereas it's those situations where it's only the rising state and the declining state, where the rising state would go, you know what? I can win this game. I can emerge in a really privileged geopolitical position if I kick the declining state to the curb. By taking advantage of its weakness, trying to break its economy, pull apart its alliance network, undercut a declining state even more militarily, what I call a predatory strategy. Now, what I found when doing the research for this book, and by the way, I should add that I examined a number of moments when there were rise and declining states of a very visceral way. I examined the relative declines of France and Austria-Hungary in the 19th century and how Britain Russia and what Prussia, then later a rising Germany, managed those states. Then I examined the American and Soviet response to the British decline during and after World War II. And then I examined the American response to the Soviet Union's decline in the last phases of the Cold War. And what really came out in those moments is not only this question of whether the rising states need help against these other threats, but equally whether the declining states themselves have military tools to kind of push back, to penalize rising state predation, right? And so even rising states that may want to grab and push a declining state to the great power curve and stomp on them along the way can be kept in check by declining states that invest in their military. Now I wanted to give this by way of background because I think it actually bears directly on this discussion of U.S.-Chinese relations today. I think Aaron is 100% right that in the contemporary world, and Stacie is right as well, that in the contemporary world, the US and China are locked in an increasingly direct and clear great power competition, where China in particular seems to feel that it has a window of opportunity to get after the United States and prey upon the United States, exploit American weaknesses. What's striking to me, and I suppose I might disagree a little bit with Aaron on this one, is not just what China is doing, but also what China isn't doing, because it does seem to me there are some degrees of continuity in China's biding time attitude, even if biding time itself is out the window. For example, China has pushed on is changing the military balance in East Asia, but there's been no new Chinese investment in its military. The rate of GDP spending on the military has remained constant by a variety of metrics. While China has asserted and taken a harder line stance in its territorial claims, as Taylor Fravel shows, it has not undertaken new territorial claims beyond this engaged in the past. As Stacie pointed out, and Manjari, as you echoed, and Ian Johnston's work bears upon, there's been limited new Chinese institutional challenges to core elements of international order. And of course, as Jessica Chen Weiss's work highlights, there's also been a somewhat limited effort on China's part to export its domestic model, which isn't to say that they aren't trying to do so in places, but it's been a limited effort. So I say all that not to understate the elements of Chinese predation, which I agree is real, but to highlight that it's a particularly limited kind, or at least there are key elements of moderation in Chinese predation. And I think my theory helps explain this. After all, China, although growing, is still a relatively weaker country than the United States, just as the US, as we know from recent policy debates, is wedded to investing heavily in its military, a military that even if it cannot, Lord knows what the military balance really looks like and what China assesses the military balance as. But the bottom line is, I doubt China believes that they could sweep the floor at the United States and not bear any costs. And if that's the case, then the threat of military retaliation on the part of the United States acts as an important brake upon Chinese aggrandizement. And I think the trend lines are such that it will look forward to doing so into the future. Now, so we have elements of predation which are real, we shouldn't understate, but I believe they're a limited kind of predation. But what's important to note as well is that I think these trend lines could also change in the future. Aaron mentioned a 20-year window where China feels it may have the wherewithal to get after and push the United States back a little bit as a great power, highlighting in particular US distractions and US problems at home. The other element in this, of course, is that great power politics are not themselves stable. And in contemporary East Asia, we talk about contemporary Asia, we talk about the continued relevance of Japan to the regional balance of power, and of course, India's own rise. And I would hazard I would guess that if and as these other countries either grow themselves or just maintain their relevance to great power politics, there may be future moments of cooperation between the US and China where China may see even a declining United States as of help in handling problems such as with India. You know, in the 1990s, for example, we spoke often of China seeking an American commitment to Asia to keep the cork in the Japanese bottle, as the phrase went. One could imagine similar dynamics coming to bear, and China seeking to at least keep the US engaged in East Asia and limiting the scope of its competition with the United States out of concern about other great powers as well. So while my story is somewhat concerning in the near term, noting that if in fact this dynamic is true, the US may have to continue working hard in keeping its military intact and being able to unilaterally penalize Chinese predation. It's certainly possible, and I think we can even look forward to and see some evidence of a moderation of this, and perhaps even a Chinese pivot to some kind of support and continued engagement with the United States, if and as the distribution of power changes in the years ahead. So with that, I'll step back.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me that even on this panel, we're really continuing this debate between accommodation and challenging, with both you and Stacie, and actually my work as well, really seeing these moments of accommodation as China rises that the United States needs to seize. We're already getting questions in the chat. For the audience out there, please put your questions in. We will get to them. But what I want to do right now is to turn it back to Aaron before we open it up to core faculty for their questions. And I'm interested in this, right? Because Kevin, is an economist. Mahesh is a health economist, right? Demography matters. And of course, Jorge was, is a policymaker and was ambassador to both China and India. So I'm really interested to get their questions before we open it up to the wider audience. But Aaron, let me just quickly turn back to you and just ask, we've had this whole conversation, but what do you think is not being answered, right, when it comes to the rise of China, either like theoretically or policy-wise, that is really not part of the conversation, but should be for people in administration to rely on? Like, what would you have liked to know when you worked in administration, for example? What's the gap in the study of China, if any? I mean, maybe it's all been covered.
Well, there are many gaps, I guess. I think what has been lacking is, in my view, is an adequate understanding or an adequate focus on the evolution of strategic thinking in China. It's not that people haven't paid some attention to that, but there's an enormous wealth of material that now emerges from this system, which has gotten more complex and has more think tanks and people involved in research tasked by the government to think about various problems. Most of it is not translated. I don't speak Chinese. The US government used to have a service that translated a lot of stuff and made it available to scholars, but no longer does for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me. And that material, I think, has proven to be enormously valuable for insights into two things in particular. One, the thinking about China's objectives, and I would say in particular now it's thinking about the wider world and what its goals are. Something which you didn't see 30 years ago, where there really was not, much of the discussion was about everybody else, but not about what China wanted and was going to do. So that's one thing. There's another somewhat more particular issue, but it's, I think, proven to be very important. An understanding of the importance in the CCP view of so-called influence operations, United Front activities, attempts to shape the perceptions of elites in other countries, and by doing so, shaping their policies through methods which date back, to the 1920s and have their origins in kind of Leninist thinking about political warfare. A lot of that stuff just has not gotten very much attention, at least not from academics in this country working on China specifically, for a variety of reasons. But it has started to get attention from a number of analysts who are outside the academic world, but are spending their time reading a lot of this material. So the short answer is there has been a lot of black boxing of China, a lot of assumptions about what had to be going on there, a tendency to overlook or ignore what people in the party were actually thinking and saying. I mean, to Stacie's point, I agree that Chinese leadership at various points has more or less successfully used language that was imported from the West in order to reassure Western observers about China's intentions. But it's also true that they've persistently been talking very openly about things which many people in the West just didn't take very seriously. Like, eventually socialism is going to triumph over capitalism. Well, of course, we know that they don't really think that. Well, it looks like they really do, whatever socialism actually needs. So I would say trying to understand the other is the thing that I would emphasize.
It's interesting you should say that, because I'll get to the questions in the chat, but I see one from my Rising Powers class, which is exactly on this, which is about the culture specificity of China's rhetoric, which I think is directed at you, Stacie. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let me just open it up to the core faculty, Professors Gallagher, Ambassador Heine, Mahesh, Professor Kara, if you had any questions before I open it up beyond. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
Hey, well, first of all, thanks, Aaron, Stacie, and Josh. Got to give Assistant Professor big props. Great stuff. Really engaging conversation. And I guess the two things that I would add are one, we can't afford a Cold War, and two, some competition is healthy. And I think one of the things that the Biden administration and academics need to think more about is that we immediately have to move away from conflating all of the issues into one thing with China. And that's really the huge mistake that the Trump administration made. And I feel like the academic community, with all these statements that were being made about China, lost sight of how that was sort of feeding into all of that over the past 4 years. The two countries are the two largest economies of the world. You can debate which one's larger than the other. It depends on which way you want to measure it. But the fact of the matter is, they're the two largest economies of the world, and basically everything runs through one of them to get to anywhere else. And so, given that, the countries, because of their shared national interests, have to work together on financial stability and trade, have to work together on climate change and pandemics, given the fact that the shocks that happen will hurt them more than anywhere else. And in your domain, war and peace and security is obviously the other third thing, right? We don't agree with each other on all those things, but those things are things that there has to be collective engagement on. And other issues that the long and growing list, where both countries have grievances with each other, are things that need to be hard conversations and conflict. But there needs to be parallel tracks. And the Trump administration, if you were talking about financial stability, you were also talking about Uyghurs. If you were talking about Uyghurs, you're also talking about the trade. And that was just an absolute disaster. And the Biden administration has elements of both of those views in there, which on one level, it's healthy competition within the administration, but I'm a little concerned that there are some folks that have still sort of captured that all in one, it's all one thing now kind of view. You see a lot of that in the State Department appointments and the Department of Defense, not so much in the NSC, and certainly not in the Treasury. And we in the academic community, especially economists who shun away from the political economy, really need to start to get a more clear and more understandable in the policy engagements. And I feel like the one weakness in the political science community is that there's 101 great folks like you thinking about the security, but the IPE community, the political economists who think about international relations and economics, I don't feel like there's a huge bench that really think about the nuances of international relations and political economy. So the second point on healthy competition, I think we have to realize as a recovering economist, I've actually been reading this book by Eikenberry, and I want to quote one sentence, which I think he hits spot on. He says, "The globalization of the liberal order was not really successful, and its failures have undermined that order's governance foundations and eroded its legitimacy and social purpose. The Western liberal order was fundamentally a security community, but in its global configuration, it has become widely seen as a framework for facilitating capitalist transactions. The progressive nationalist underpinnings of liberal internationalism have eroded. What John Ruggie would refer to embedded liberalism has been thrown out for neoliberalism, and therefore the rise of all this nationalism and so forth, it wasn't caused by Trump, that Trump is a symptom of that. And one of the things that rising powers have done in the liberal order have actually kept us on our own toes with healthy competition. The rise of the BRICS, the creation of the BRICS Bank, the AIB, the Belt Road Initiative, we all might have problems with specificities around them, but all of those things, inside things like the IMF and the World Bank, and outside, have given them more clout and help shape these institutions and actually keep them a little bit more on the toes that they were built to be about than they would have been without that counterbalance, because the US, especially in the international economic institutions, has really strayed from its 1944 foundations.
Kevin, I think you just brought up the importance of interdisciplinary research without actually using those words. But Josh, you had a two-finger on that.
Yeah, just very briefly, just to piggyback on Kevin's point and fundamentally agree that these issues can and should be segmented. You know, this has been the question of whether all issues bundled together or can be segmented has long been a dividing point, not just in American politics, but also looking historically. And I want to connect the dots here between Kevin's commentary and Aaron's commentary. Aaron asked at the outset what we can gain from looking at prior historical periods and what competition looks like in an era when international institutions bind countries and, of course, economic interdependence bind countries. And the ones that come to mind, of course, are the Anglo-German rivalry in the era of the leading up to the First World War, a topic Aaron and Stacie have each written about, but also Anglo-American competition in the first half of the 19th century, which no one really analyzed. This is a moment in time of economic interdependence, institutional binding, and yet strategic competition. So I think one of the real insights that comes out of a historical look and a rigorous application of IR theory to these cases is to recognize that not all bad things cluster together, not all good things cluster together, and that segmenting the strategic implications of these different domains is actually a really fertile ground for a nuanced approach to policy and theory.
Aaron, you had Jorge, can I let Aaron respond with the two-finger and then I'll get to you? Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Aaron.
Just a very quick thought. My understanding, which is by no means perfect, of the way the CCP leadership thinks about these things leads me to believe that they do not think that issues can be segmented in this way. In other words, that in their view, everything is a domain of competition, frankly. It doesn't mean that even if they think that way, it might not be possible to cooperate with them in some areas. But I think their view of the world is essentially zero sum. And they do see all of these different areas as domains of competition. The desire on the part of the current administration and part of many people to sort of wall off some parts of the relationship so that we can achieve progress on certain issues is understandable, and doing that would be desirable. I think it may be more difficult than it seems.
Jorge?
Yes, just very briefly to Aaron, on the question of the Biden administration and its take on China policy. You know, some people have hope that there might be, if not a reset, at least a toning down of the rhetoric and of the style that existed in the previous 4 years. A lot of indications are that that is not the case. And according to some readings, there are essentially two factions within the Biden camp in relation to China. One of them, the so-called values faction, and the other, the realist faction. And the values faction, which seems to be gaining the upper hand, put things like Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan front and center in the relationship, and particularly in this new moment. Now, I hear what Aaron says in terms of his interpretation of how China sees this. My take would be that this is the equivalent of China saying, yes, Black Lives Matter, independence of Puerto Rico, the tragic situation of Virgin Islanders is a key concern of China and its relations with the United States. We would like answers, we need responses, what is happening? Is this the best way forward to move a relationship between these leading powers? A lot of people would wonder whether that is really the best approach to move forward in a relationship on which so much is at stake.
Thank you, Jorge. I'm going to turn to Mahesh here for a second because I think he had a finger on this. But Mahesh, I mean, you're the health economist in the room, right? And we haven't brought up the word pandemic even once, or actually the demographic trends in China as well as health institutions. How do you think this matters, and what is an area of cooperation that you see here, if any?
Yeah, I mean, so when we think about when we think about the pandemic and the world we're currently living in, I'm sure that this entire discussion would have been like a fascinating one in person, but we're clearly on Zoom for a reason from all the events over the past year. And I think the thing that like always strikes me is that like, given the increased globalized world that we live in, like, pandemics do not respect borders, pandemics do not respect states. And there's going to have to be this, like whether states, if they're either in competition or collaboration with one another, have to find ways of reconciling these larger, these larger trends, right? Especially when it comes to health. And this is something that I would love to get like more insight from the panel on how has the pandemic, for example, and these these trends across the past year, how have they like highlighted like these relations going forward between like China and the US, but also, then this actually leads to like a second question to me for the panel, is that a lot of the trends and the observations that we're making are coming from like the relationships across states, but given how much variation and heterogeneity there is within China, like across the provinces and also within the US, I would just love to get an idea of like what the panel thinks about how the discourse around rising powers like fits in with these underlying narratives of like economic growth across like within regions, economic equality or inequality. One of the key observations that are made, especially in China, is like the spatial clustering across urban to rural, the urban-rural disaggregations and how different, for example, the east coast of China is from like the rest of the country, which occupies most of its space. Thinking about like economic growth and productivity and what all of these mean within the framework and the discourse of the rising powers and competition or collaboration that we've been having so far. As I'm not a political scientist, as you can clearly see but I'm thinking about this as like a demographer and someone who works on economic growth and development. Like, how does that fit in within the narratives of like both China and the US as they think about competition or collaboration? Yeah.
Thanks, Mahesh. I think Kevin got disconnected, but why don't I let Stacie and then Aaron tackle that, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
So this is already a fantastic conversation, and Mahesh, you said a lot of a couple of things that really struck me, and so I'll stick to those. The first one on this question of pandemics don't know borders, and also just the question of increased ties between the United States and China, and how that will affect their competition. This goes back to Aaron's point. I think absolutely right, and to Josh's point that like we need to understand the dynamics are going to be different because of this increased interdependence. But I also think it's really important to not think that those dynamics are immediately, or there's something in there that's going to push that towards collaboration, right? And I'm actually sorry Kevin isn't here because he talked about IPE, and I would actually say that there has been a resurgence now within international political economy, particularly think about the work on weaponized interdependence and the ways in which states actually exploit their position within these global networks for purposes of coercion, right? And I think we saw that increasingly with the United States and China battling over 5G and semiconductors. We've seen this in vaccine nationalism and the cutting of supply chains during the pandemic, right? It changes the dynamics, but it doesn't necessarily make them less competitive or move them towards collaboration. But I think trying to understand what that looks like in the context of those network ties is really important. To the question about understanding China is not a homogenous space, I think that's extremely important if we're going to understand what the CCP in particular is going to face and continue to face during its rise, emergence, and then maintenance as a great power. But I think that actually goes to the point of why it is China increasingly turns to narratives of rising power, great power, return to great power status, and things that sound in many ways very anti-liberal institutions. China understands that it's facing a very heterogeneous population and needs to have narratives that maintain its uniformity, right? It needs to have these types of things that binds it together as a political community with a purpose. And my concern is as those pressures, as the kind of heterogeneity places pressures on the government, we're going to see even more of a turn towards this type of nationalist rhetoric and action.
Aaron?
Yes, just back to the ambassador's question. I don't know, what the correlation of forces in the Biden administration is or is going to be, because it's not fully staffed up. And the division you suggest may be the one that exists. I would have expected that there would be a grouping of people who, some of whom might be more on the values end, some of whom might be more on the power political side, who would favor taking a more competitive posture towards China, and others, some of them on the economic side, who might prefer to back away from some of the things that the Trump administration did. But we'll have to see how that shakes out. I also, there are other explanations for the language that the new administration has chosen to use. And one is domestic politics and the desire to avoid being accused of being soft. I mean, so what was striking to me about the recent campaign, among many other things, was that there was this competition between Democrats and Republicans to see who could take the harder line on China. So that's a real change. And that shows you that in the judgment of professional politicians who presumably care about this stuff, there's been a shift in public attitudes, which they have to monitor and respond to. On the question about health, and it really goes back to the point that I believe Kevin made earlier, he said the powers have to work together, but they don't. They should work together. They would benefit from working together, but that doesn't mean that they will. And they may fail to do so for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with an attempt to get an advantage, to get relative gains. Just on the pandemic, I mean, just two thoughts. One, whatever we think about the origins of this, the early Chinese handling of it was not optimal for reasons having to do with the dynamics of the regime. And even since, there has not been the kind of cooperation that would have permitted a better response, or now a better understanding of how this all played out. So there's an example. Cooperation should have happened, but it didn't to the extent that it should have. The other just sort of disturbing thought, again, coming back to my point about my understanding of how the CCP leadership thinks, if everything is a zero-sum competition and everything is about power, their reading of the pandemic right now, and there's some evidence to suggest this, is it's actually been good for them. It allows them to say, our system works better than the Western democracies because we squashed this thing. Our system is working better economically because we're actually growing, and the Western economies are contracting. This makes us more appealing to third parties who are perhaps in between. So how this appears to the CCP leadership may be very different than we might prefer for it to appear. And I think there's some evidence to suggest that they are thinking of it in that way.
Thank you, Aaron. So let me take a question that came up from the audience, which I think is interesting, and it's for any one of the panelists who chooses to answer it, which is why did the engagement policy of the United States fail? And they ask whether it's because liberalism is simply flawed. And I would actually add to that. I would say, is it because the policy was redundant? I mean, Aaron, you talked about how during the Bush administration, the United States wanted to draw China in by talking about China as a responsible stakeholder. And you're referring, I think, to Robert Zoellick's statement, right, where he talked about China that way. But, in my book, I looked at narratives in China in the 1990s, which were very, very accommodational. And actually, China is talking about itself as a responsible stakeholder that buys into multilateralism well before Robert Zoellick ever talks about it, right? So I think 1992 is when I found the first reference in a Chinese academic journal about China being a responsible stakeholder. Although we often refer to Robert Zoellick's statement. So this question of why the engagement policy failed, was it a failure of liberalism? Was it simply redundant, and this was something China was already doing? And I know that this could be answered by any one of you, so I'll just leave it up to the three of you to see who wants to jump in.
Well, I'll take a first crack at it. It's a huge question, and of course we have to ask: did it fail? What parts of it failed or didn't? I gave my kind of brief answer at the beginning, which is the CCP leadership was well aware that Western leaders, American leaders in particular, saw engagement as a tool for promoting what they referred to, what now would refer to as peaceful evolution. And they were determined that that should not happen. So they, from the very beginning, did things and continued to do things that certainly preserved the monopoly on political power of the CCP, even in a more complex and developing society, and also maintained control over the economy in ways that Western economists and political leaders had thought would be either impossible or so obviously suboptimal that no one would want to do it. And in fact, instead, they managed to keep their grip because they saw it as critical to their own survival. As far as the, the attitude towards the international system and responsible stakeholder, I think it depends, I guess, in part on where you look. And there certainly have been in the academic world in China, people whose views more closely resemble their counterparts in the West and who were talking about international institutions and multilateralism and the desirability of this. Some of them were also at various points talking about the desirability of political liberalization. Those views, for whatever reason, have not emerged as dominant. Now, you can say they never were going to because they ran counter to the fundamental principles of the regime, or that because of the way the competition for power at the top of the CCP system played out, we wound up with leaders who were not inclined to think in that way. But either way, regardless of what those people may have been saying back in the 1990s, I don't think that's the view now of the CCP leaders. And on the responsible stakeholder piece in particular, my recollection, going back to that period, is that the official reaction and the reaction in the kind of official think tank world in China to this proposal was one of puzzlement and suspicion. And the belief was that the United States was trying to lure China into a trap by making them take responsibility for things that they didn't want to be responsible for. Again, this kind of zero-sum thinking.
Manjari, can I jump in for half a second?
Yes, I was actually going to ask you to do that. And then I have a question directed at Stacie.
Oh, perfect. So I preempted the game. I fundamentally agree with Aaron on the diagnosis of where accommodation went wrong. But I also want to flag that when we talk about accommodation, I think it's important to also not overstate what it was, right? We have to remember the American grand strategy was very much wedded to primacy in the 1990s and 2000s as well. That is, the US effort to accommodate China's rise was also embedded in a larger framework that, as the 1992 Defense Planning Guidance and its subsequent revisions really underscored, were focused on maintaining the US as the world's sole great power, as the unipole. And Aaron is noting rightly, I think, that accommodation was designed to try to push China to embrace Western or American style systems of governance and values, but it was also part and parcel with a broader strategy to maintain American dominance, providing further impetus for China not to play by America's game, right? Not to play this game. So accommodation in its own roundabout way was not just a half-baked liberal vision of how the world would evolve, but it was also a half-baked realist vision for how the world evolves. And I think this is a real indictment of some of the foreign policy mores that drove American strategy in the 1990s, certainly, and perhaps continued as well. So I think it's important not to overstate quite how accommodationist it was. This wasn't the US giving away the shop and going, please China, play by our rules. There was also an element of geopolitics that actually undercut the message as well and reinforced the drivers that Aaron was referring to.
Thanks, Josh. So Stacie, this is a direct question for your book, I think, which is, the question is, is legitimation rhetoric culture specific, right? Because you talk about how rising powers use rhetoric essentially to signal their intentions to great powers. And this goes back to the point that Aaron made before about the lack of Chinese language specialists and the lack of understanding of documents that are in Mandarin. So do you think there are misunderstandings and misinterpretations that arise from the use of certain languages with a certain perspective, culture, and ideology?
I think that's a great question. And I think there are a couple of parts to it. So I think on the one hand, it's not the case that all legitimation strategies that leaders use are going to be culturally specific. because I mean, that's why diplomats are good at their job. I mean, they understand that they have to actually speak across cultural boundaries, right? And therefore they use things that are seen as international norms or an international language of diplomacy in order to do so. And I think as an example to this, I mean, one of the cases in my book is the rise of Japan. And one thing that is, I mean, I know other people have looked at this case as well. It's fascinating going through this case to actually watch Japan's leaders in government after the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century basically work methodically through the language of international diplomacy to build up a language, to build up a legitimation strategy that would be understood by the British, that would be understood by the United States, and really for strategic purposes, whether or not it was justifying Japan's own expansion, whether or not it was arguing to overturn the unequal treaties that were imposed on Japan after its opening. So it really understood that there's this international language out there as well. But I think what this question points out to was something I was highlighting in my talk, is that you're not simply speaking to an international audience. You're also speaking to your domestic one. And that's really important for a rising power, because ultimately we use rising power. What do we mean by that? We're talking about a state and a society that is attempting to mobilize its own population, right? In order to increase economic output, in order to, in order to increase military strength, right? These are acts of mobilization at home. And in order to mobilize that power, that you need to be able to convince your population, your political community, that is something that's worth investing in, because it's not easy. Right? I mean, look at some of the processes that have gone on in China. Look at historical cases of the rising United States or the UK. This is urbanization. This is dislocation, right? These are really, really trying processes. So you have to tell your population why it is you're doing it. That's where I think things have to be culturally resonant. And that is where I do think that there's room for misinterpretation, right? I mean, by the way, even when there are language specialists that get on the ground, the misinterpretation can still be there, because sometimes then you get an exaggeration of, well, this country is now very nationalist. You see this in Japanese specialists in the 1920s, right? So they take something that's really about political mobilization and turn this into, well, this now must be this revolutionary drive. So yeah, they're basically, I guess my point is, it needs to be culturally resonant. There's also a mix of international language, but yes, all of this means there's plenty of room for misinterpretation.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And actually, that reminds me of, the Chinese phrase that Xi Jinping brought up often, which is China dream, right? Which, in the West, we were trying to parse it out. Well, is it the American dream? Is it this individualistic, anyone can become president? And it really wasn't. It was directed towards a domestic audience. And it was really about societal development, right? So the dream was a collective, not the one of the American individual when we talk about the American dream. So let's see. I have another question, which is a really interesting one. And I think this is more towards Aaron, which is that regarding revisionism, the main concern isn't that China wants to take over the world as a well thought out grand plan or strategy, but it's rather a series of moves that make the system more pliant to China and her interests. And so the question that they're asking is, do you think that China's revisionism, so to speak, is more a bottom up than a top down understanding of hegemonic challenge and change, right? It's a series of steps that'll make the system more pliant than this alternative grand strategic system that will change the world.
I think in general that accords with my view of how they're going about it. And there's a significant difference between being a status quo power and being a revisionist power. And there's a significant difference also between being a revisionist power and a revolutionary power. I don't think they're a revolutionary power, but they're, in my view, pretty clearly a revisionist power. And that's showing up in a variety of different ways. It's most obvious closest to home, and maybe the most obvious of all regarding the territorial claims, of course, not only maritime claims, but on the border with India. China has a view of how things should be arranged that's different from the current arrangements. It also relates to the persistence of American alliances in the region, which China's leaders have denounced and now do so even more vociferously, I think, as a source of instability. So the suggestion that the US is gone, things will be better. So they want to change things at the regional level and have for some time. But I think what's becoming clearer is that they also are thinking now about how to reshape the world, maybe not the whole world, but pieces of the world. And I would say in two respects. One, the functioning and existence and structure of international institutions, which I think are now, from the CCP perspective, yet another domain of competition, where China has, in part by ingratiating itself with the leaders of many smaller countries in institutions where one country, one vote is the rule, have gained a good deal of influence without the US really having paid very much attention. So there are ways in which they're trying to transform some of these institutions, undermining at least their initial intent, human rights, definition of human rights. In other cases, they are ignoring institutions if they do things that the CCP doesn't like the arbitration court regarding maritime claims, which ruled against them in 2016. In other instances, they're continuing to use existing institutions to the extent that they serve their interests, like the WTO. I don't think US and Chinese interests converge in the WTO, but China has used it and used the rules very much to its advantage. And in other domains, they're now creating their own institutions, which put themselves at the center. So there's a institutional dimension to the global competition, and then also regionally. I mentioned the global South. That really does seem to be a kind of central focus of Chinese thinking about how to sustain economic growth, how to gain diplomatic support, how to as Mao said, encircle the cities from the countryside, how to strengthen China's position in relation to the US and the advanced industrial countries. So it's not a grand plan to take over the world. It's not a grand plan to plant the red flag on Capitol Hill, but it is also not simply confined to China's immediate neighborhood. And it is a work in progress, I think.
Right. Although, of course, the global South is also quite wary of China in many respects as well, right? Particularly when you see, how China has been stung by the criticism of its imperialistic policies in Africa, for one. So there's definitely a suspicion and a balancing act there too, despite China's outreach to the global South, which, by the way, I should point out, goes back to even Mao's days, right, when China gave copious amounts of foreign aid that it really couldn't afford. So, just related to this, we have another question on the role of regional institutions, particularly those that have neither Chinese nor American membership, such as ASEAN. How do you think, or can these institutions play a role, if any, in either China's rise or America's constraint of China's rise? Josh, do you want to try and tackle that? Or not? I wonder if Josh, did you hear me on that, Josh?
No, could you repeat the question? I was having microphone problems.
Yes, the question was, what are the role of regional institutions that have neither Chinese nor American membership, right, such as ASEAN, but also see a growing amount of power in either China's rise or American constraint? Like, do you think those can play a role?
It's a good question, and I'm not an expert on international institutions, but I do think that one of the limiting factors is that institutions tend to only be binding to the extent that states invest in them, right? To the extent they actually are backed by the resources and capabilities of powerful states. And while it is certainly true that areas like ASEAN and other venues have very capable regional actors in them, unfortunately, the more and more this competition between the US and China devolves into a truly back and forth dyadic contest, where it's the US on one side and China on the other, the more and more we're likely to see kind of these regional institutions. I'm not going to say they're going to lack impact, because it will certainly affect things on some key issues, but they're not going to be central to the core of the great power competition that's emerging, and we know this a little bit historically, right? No one really talks about the League of Neutrality when it comes to Napoleon. We don't really talk about the non-aligned movement as at the core of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This is not to endorse this position. It's not to embrace this reality, but it is to, I think, reflect what the trend lines seem to be.
And with that, we are out of time. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining. We are going to now stop the live stream. But thank you very much. This was really, really enlightening. A lot of good lessons here. And we had quite a few people watching. So hopefully this is going to be contributing to the debate as we go forward. Thanks very much.